last day of this conference. My name is Sylwia Chutnik. I'm a writer, academic teacher, and social activist, and I am pleased to chair this debate, who was organized by Non-Anthropocentric Cultural Subjectivity Research Center. And I would also like to especially thanks to Professor Paweł Piszczatowski for coordinating this group. I'm really happy to be a part of this conference. I'm also happy that we have the opportunity to meet online on this hybrid version. I know it's not so luxury just to be with each other, but I hope that our discuss will include every people, not only from the online session, but also the audience. So thank you very much that you are here. I would also like to say hello to all of the people who are watching and hearing us from computers and cell phones. Of course, you are invited to ask questions, to have the reflection, to comment us. We will also have time to prepare so-called Q&A session or just a discussion. So we really want to invite you to be a part of it. First, I'd like to introduce our participants. So I will start with Susan Stryker from the University of Arizona. I don't know how to use the hey Susan once again. Susan Stryker is an award-winning scholar and filmmaker whose historical research, theoretical writing, and creative works have helped shape the cultural conversation on transgender topics since the early 90s. Dr. Stryker earned her PhD in United States history at the University of California, Berkeley in the beginning of 90s. Later, she had lots of postdoctoral fellowship, one-year appointment, and visiting faculty members at many, many universities in US, Australia, and Canada. She is the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of numerous books and anthologies, including Gay by the Bay, a history of queer culture in the San Francisco Bay Area, Queer Pulp, Perverse Passions in the Golden Age of the Paperback, the Transgender Studies Reader, and Transgender History. And I know from Paweł that it will translate one of her iconic article, but unfortunately in German, yeah? So still we are looking for translation in Polish, if everybody, oh, yeah, there will be, okay, so good information. So hi Susan once again, it's a pleasure to have you here in this debate. The second speaker is Maryna Shevtsova. Hi. Maryna is political science and human rights activist with an interdisciplinary background, the international economic relations, gender studies, psychological, political science, and she was just honored to receive Emma Goldman Award 2022 for her engagement in feminist research and human rights activism. I just have to say I'm really jealous because Emma Goldman is a very important person for me. So once again, congratulations for this award. Maryna is currently a visiting professor and Utopia postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia. She is also a senior FWO fellow, part of the board of Gender, the European Association for Gender Research, Education and Documentation, and a broad association for academics, practitioners, activists, and institutions in the field of women's gender, transgender, sexuality, and queer studies, feminist research, women's, so all of the things that I think that we will talk about it today. And outside academia, she is also participated at the diversity and inclusion expert, coach, freelance consultant, and trainer. Once again, hello. And last but not least, Łukasz Szulc. Łukasz is a senior lecturer in the digital media and culture at the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures at the University of Manchester. He specialized in critical and cultural studies of digital media at the intersections of gender, sexuality, and transnationalism with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe, especially Poland. He previously worked at the University of Sheffield, London, School of Economics and Political Science, and University of Antwerp. He is a member of editorial boards at the International Journal of Cultural Studies, International Journal of Communication and Culture of Critique. He recently published, amongst others, the monograph Transnational Homosexuals in Communist Poland, Cross-Border Flows in Gay and Lesbian Magazines, and co-edited LGBTQ's Media and Culture in Europe. Hello, Łukasz. Like you heard, our guests has different backgrounds, not only from this academic level, but also the national level. So, because of the title of our debate, Trans Identities, Global Views and Local Context, it is also important to have in mind that we are here in Poland, and now we have a very difficult political and sociology situation because of the so-called minority groups, especially LGBTQR plus people. That's why I think this debate is very important as an issue of our so-called protest. I don't know if I have to say that, but I think it's also important to notice that we, as a part of the group of minority, in this academical space and this sphere, it is also important for us to discuss this subject. So let me begin with our debate. We start at 5 to 10 minute presentations of our speakers about the problems and topics they deal with on a daily basis in their scientific and activist work, and that we just heard before. You have many of them, so feel free to have enough time to speak about the most important for you areas that you are working on it now. And we will start with this quick presentation by Susan Stryker.
Right. Well, thank you everyone for having me here today. Pavel and Sylwia for your work in organizing this, my co-panelists. I wish I could be there in person. So I was asked to say three things. It's like, what is my work? What topics do I study? And what problems do I face in doing my work? So as you heard in the introduction, in my introduction just now, thank you for that. I've been doing work in transgender studies for about 30 years at this point. I think of myself as an interdisciplinary transgender studies scholar, as well as a historian and a filmmaker. My career started in a real sense with the publication of an article called My Words to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, which is the article that I understand is soon to be translated into Polish. What I do in that piece is I recuperate the figure of the monster in Frankenstein, and use that to articulate a speaking position for trans people that simultaneously resists pathologization while still engaging with biomedicine, and that also critiques transphobia within feminism and queer theory. Some people claim this is the first peer-reviewed academic article about trans issues by a trans person, but I haven't looked at that myself, so I don't know if it's true, but it's something that circulates about that piece. I spent many years working outside the academy. I was the executive director of the Gay and Lesbian Historical Society in San Francisco for many years. I've always been interested in doing public-facing scholarship. I directed an Emmy award-winning documentary, directed that with my friend and colleague Victor Silverman, called Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, which is about a little-known historical incident in San Francisco where trans women and sex workers and unhoused youth rioted against police violence and harassment in San Francisco's impoverished Tenderloin neighborhood in 1966, which is 3 years before the more famous Stonewall riots in New York. The next part of my career really worked to help institutionalize transgender studies as a field. I wrote a history book that could be a transgender history book that could be used as a teaching text. I co-edited anthologies of transgender related scholarship. I helped launch an academic journal, TSQ, Transgender Studies Quarterly, and was able to direct a trans studies faculty cluster hire when I was at the University of Arizona. I retired in 2019 from my tenured professorship, so I could devote less time to institutional service and more time to doing the kind of public-facing scholarship and media work that I really like. The problems that I address in my work, just to tick those off quickly, I do research finding empirical evidence of cross-cultural trans-historical variability in sex-gender systems. I do work on histories of social movements of self-identified trans people, work on cultural production by and about trans people. I take a strong interest in biopolitics and in the ideology of what I call biologism, beliefs in particularly racial beliefs about the meanings of embodied difference. I look at the historicity of concepts and systems of thought. I'm interested in methodologies of embodied knowledge production, and I'm really interested in the problem of situating our quotidian experiences, our day-to-day experiences, in the largest cosmic, ontological, epistemological frames that we can think of, because I think that's really vital work for us to be doing as we try to think and act and imagine our ways out of the late Anthropocene. The basic problems that I face in my working life, they're just the basic problems that a trans person tends to face in our society, like basic problems about healthcare, housing, poverty. That over the course of my life, I've managed to do well, but I've definitely directly experienced violence and discrimination as a trans person, and spent many years being considered unemployable. To do my work now, it's like I experience a lot of online trolling and antagonism from people who are hostile to trans issues. When I've been hired at jobs, it's like my employers have been targeted through voice, telephone and email campaigns asking for me to be fired. Publications, when I publish, sometimes the publishers are attacked by anti-trans people saying that work that I have written or edited needs to be withdrawn from print. But besides these very personal acts of hostility, it's like the bigger problem, I would say, is just what I think of as the metastasizing of an anti-gender ideology, a perspective that to think about gender itself is wrong, that it's a pernicious framework for thinking, and that I'm very alarmed at how hegemonic this anti-gender ideology seems to be becoming right now, that it just shuts down thought on the kinds of work that I do. Transgender issues are increasingly weaponized in the cultural wars and civilizational struggles that we tend to be involved in this moment of political and economic and climate crisis. Which to me just makes the work seem all the more important to understand how trans people have become a kind of phantasm that so many of our systemic woes get projected onto, that we get scapegoated and targeted as a solution to, as a fake solution to real world problems. All right, that's what I've got to say. Thank you for your time. I also want to say, because I was originally told that the program would be 1 hour, I might have to step away in about 50 minutes for just a few moments, but I'll be listening in even if I turn my camera off. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Susan. And now I would like to have Łukasz to speak about your work in academia and, of course, about the issues that we are here.
Okay, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Łukasz. I'm more of a social sciencey person, so I'm a little bit out of the blue here in the humanist conference, but I think that a lot of topics that I'm touching on is also very humanistic topics or topics of humanities. So not really that much out of the blue, I would say. So what I'm doing in my work most of the time, I study the queer cultures, basically. So what ordinary people do in their everyday life, especially the media cultures, what they do on social media, how they produce magazines, how they use dating apps, and so on. And today I would like to tell you about my recent project, which was with Polish LGBTQs in the UK. So people who moved to the UK after 2004. And that project I conducted in 2018 and 2019. First, it was kind of sociological project that first I had a survey online survey with about 800 people. And then I had 30 interviews, face-to-face interviews with quite a diverse group of LGBTQ people. So I'm using it very consciously. It was not just gay men that I interviewed. There was a lot of good range of LGBTQ people. And 6 of them were people who identify their gender in a kind of diverse way. And those people I want to focus on because the panel is on kind of trans identities. So 6 of my interviewees who were identifying in very, very different ways. Some of them identify as genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, or one of them identified as a girl fag. So before actually I will tell you a little bit more about them, I would also want to acknowledge some kind of larger context for that. And I think it's quite important to mention that in the recent, about 10 years, I would say, we observe a very significant gender diversity mainstreaming, especially in Anglo-American culture, but also somewhere else in the world. So, of course, gender diversity is nothing new. It is very well documented across history in different cultures. However, I think there was a period, of course, to make gender very much binary. That was also part of the colonial legacies. And then in the last decade, something happened that people actually started discussing gender diversity in a very much popular, it becoming much part of the popular discussions. So for example, in 2014, we have the Facebook introducing new gender options in their interface. So one of the global media platform, instead of just giving you option men or women, started introducing, at the very beginning, they added 70 different genders. Then they added even more, including the custom gender. Also, the OkCupid, the popular dating app, did the same. I also checked the Google Trends for some of the words. So Google Trends is a tool that tells you relatively how popular particular terms are in Google search engine. So what basically people are searching for in Google search engine. And you can see when you check, for example, gender fluid, there is nothing, nothing, nothing. In 2014 is kind of the first spike. So we can see that people starting being interested in those topics. This coincides with a lot of kind of celebrities coming out as gender fluid, non-binary, Sam Smith, Miley Cyrus, and so on. So there's a momentum around this kind of mid-2010s that the gender diversity became something that people discuss, and the role of digital media is quite important there as well. We can see the communities, for example, on Tumblr, start organizing themselves around those hashtags, genderqueer, gender fluid, and so on. At the same time, what Susan was also mentioning, we observe a very well-organized backlash against gender diversity. And this backlash takes on different forms here in Poland, but also in many different countries. We have this gender ideology discussions. It's not only Central Eastern European countries. We have that also in the US. We have that in Germany, France. Where I'm based in the UK, gender ideology is not a very popular term, but so-called gender critical discourse is very popular. So it's coming from maybe different places. It's maybe less coming from populist right-wing sources, but more from kind of some groups of trans-exclusive radical feminists. But you know, the very basic there is kind of similar. They just very much stick to the kind of determinism, biological determinism of gender, and want to show the primacy of sex over gender, and this very clear division for them. So I think that's something interesting is happening, that this gender diversity became contested, either people finding their position pro or against, but it's very, very much contested. And also what I want to emphasize is that it's a transnational phenomena. It's very often we study it within national context, but we have to recognize that those debates are taking place in many different places around the world, more or less around the same time. They take different shapes sometimes, kind of being localized, but they're actually happening, and that's important to mention. So in that context, I kind of turned to this, my research, how my kind of participants, I think, migrants, gender fluid or gender diverse migrants are like really great people to talk about them, because by definition migrants are also showing us the transnational aspect of that and show how the different local, national or transnational scales are coming together and being intertwined in those kind of discussions. So the issues of using different languages, using different social media platforms, or even using the same platform, for example, Facebook, but posting something in Polish for your family and friends in Poland, and then posting something in English for your friends in the UK, that's also proved to be like they were posting, for example, different things about gender because they were imagining the audiences in different ways. So just to start the discussion, I would like to give you just two examples from like quotes from my interviews, specifically focusing on language, how they were navigating, some of my gender diverse participants, how they were navigating the gender identification, or what I actually called disidentification, building on the queer of color critique by Jose Esteban Munoz. So how they were like kind of identifying or disidentifying differently in different kind of linguistic contexts. So one of my participants, they said, it's difficult to talk about identity in Polish because I don't live in this language. So while in English I get comfortable with the category non-binary, I have no idea how to translate it into Polish. It feels like I have an invented identity in English, which isn't the first language for me. So of course there is an easy translation for non-binary into Polish. It's just that person learning about it in English, kind of feeling comfortable saying that in English, and it feels just weird because maybe that person particularly didn't hear that in English or in Polish and so on. But at the same time, I think it's very interesting how that person was saying that like I'm feeling comfortable using that in English, but also English is not my first language. So it's like, I feel like an invented thing because it's actually not my first language. And just the last quote that I want to read here is from another young participant living, so that participant was based in London, the other one is a small town in Scotland. And she, at the time of the interview, I identify mostly as an androgynous male, but also using male sometimes. But then after the interview, she contacted me saying that I'm using now she, her pronouns, so that's why now I'm using, to talk about her, I used those pronouns. And so basically she also told me that when she learned about those kind of different terms for gender diversity when she was in Poland, mostly, still in Poland, but still from English language sources, mostly fan fiction online, and some YouTube tutorials, makeup tutorials of some gender diverse people. So she felt like I just basically like easier for me to talk about it in English. So even though she was fluent in Polish and our interview was in Polish, when I asked her about gender or sexual identity, she was like, can I switch to English? I was like, yeah, sure. And it was a kind of Ponglish conversation we had. And then she added, there is also another thing. To use then those words for gender and sexual identity in Polish is to engage with the ideas of Polishness. And to engage with the ideas of Polishness is to pretty much think about what it is to be a Pole. And to be a Pole is not to be a queer. And this is something that I have experienced myself on my own skin, though through all the abuse I have gone through. So to me, it's kind of like whenever I say, even when I say the word gay in Polish, that doesn't sound right to me. That sounds to me as I am engaging in a sort of like hate politics. So I'm very happy to continue the discussion of specifically showing how this kind of different local, national, and transnational contexts coming together in this kind of larger changes and developments around the gender diversity. Thank you.
So I will use it. Thank you very much. To be a Pole is not to be a queer. Yeah, another subject for another discussion. Very, very important. And now I would like to Maryna say about her work on this academic level.
Okay,
Yeah?
does it work? Yeah,
Yes.
it works. Good evening, everyone, and greetings to those for whom it's not evening now or who will be watching us in recording. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm Maryna Shevtsova. I'm Ukrainian citizen. I've been living abroad for quite some time, but I was also commuting, so to say, and working as the LGBTQ rights activist back home in Ukraine. My research, so to explain you first where I'm coming from, my research initially was on LGBTQ movement in Ukraine and in Turkey. I was looking at LGBTQ activism, at how it got professionalized, especially in Ukraine, where it became a more actual issue later as compared to Turkey, as compared to many other European countries. So it became very visible and active after 2010. And somehow studying activism, I became activist myself. And I've been working mostly in two directions. So first, I was working with the families of LGBTQ people with parents. And I would say, it would be safe to say that 90% of those parents were mothers. And those were mothers who had problems with accepting their children coming out. And another part of the work was education, so I worked with psychologists, with teachers, a little bit with journalists, basically trying to explain them, you know, what homosexuality is, what trans people are, how to work with such kind of teenagers, how to support them, how to talk to their parents, and so on. And through that, I also came to the topic of queer migration, because many of our mothers who joined our organization for the support, their sons or their children actually had to leave Ukraine at a certain point. And that's how I also started to look at queer migration. I did interviews. It was already after the beginning of the war in Ukraine in 2014, annexation of Crimea, and the beginning of military conflict in Donbass. But of course, it was still a long time until the large-scale invasion. And so I conducted some interviews with queer migrants in the US, primarily, also with some of them in Europe, but the US was my main field. At that point, one thing that I probably wanted to mention here, so unfortunately the sampling was a little bit restricted. Most of my interviewees, or not most, all my interviewees actually were cisgender gay men. Then one interesting difference that I observed, and I will explain later why it is important to mention it. So I had some respondents who came to the US much earlier than 2014, 12, 11. So of course by 2018 and 19, when my fieldwork there was, they were quite integrated already and so on and so that, but more importantly, they didn't really, well, of course they still identify themselves as people who grew up in Ukraine, and some of them even spoke Ukrainian, some spoke Russian, but many largely associated themselves also with the Russian-speaking, Russian-Ukrainian, but predominantly Russian-speaking community, for example, in the US. And they stayed away from Ukrainian diaspora because the Ukrainian diaspora in those parts, in Chicago, in New York, where I did my field work, is largely concentrated around the church, which of course is not, the kind of communities that often, with many exceptions, but not often is not very friendly towards LGBTQ people. However, the groups that started coming closer to 2010, 11, 12, 14 already differentiated themselves strongly from other migrants from post-Soviet countries, and especially from Russians. And you might know that or probably not, and in 2019 at the World Pride that took place in New York, actually for the first time we had separate column for Ukrainians. They didn't want at that point to march together with Russians because the conflict was around, well, banal topic, to whom belongs Crimea, So even there in post-Soviet LGBTQ community in the US, it was kind of a political debate. And this is when I started paying attention. It wasn't the central issue of my research then, but I started paying attention to how two issues, nationalism, national belonging, and queer identity are coming together, because there is this notion that nationalism is usually homophobic. We know, of course, about homonationalism, but still, when we're talking about nationalism, more often we speak about the heterosexual bodies. The family that produces heterosexual children that, then will be either mothers or potential defenders of the nation. So what happened with my research lately, and then I actually started looking at anti-gender movements. So the topic of my research until February was anti-gender movements in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And it was something that was as active or compared, we could compare it with the developments that have been taking place in Poland, even though abortion, for example, was never an issue in Ukraine, but yet this idea about trans identity and how children at schools will be confused by gender ideology and how they will all become confused about their gender and so on, it was present. What happened after February 24th is that, of course, that many LGBTQ people had to flee Ukraine or were displaced within Ukraine. And I switched naturally and within my activism towards humanitarian assistance to those groups, but also to, of course, studying what's going on, what are the processes in Ukrainian society and in the neighboring countries. And one of the things that, again, I've been observing is this increase of this trend of queer, or I would say LGBTQ identity, Ukrainian LGBTQ identity, becoming more nationalist or more patriotic as they define it. But, where is this in line, and which term is seen more positively, which is seen less negatively? And then from here, I could go in many directions, and I would be happy to go in the further discussion. So one issue that I would like to mention is, of course, LGBTQ military. You know that this is the topic that now is popular in Western media. There are pictures of Ukrainian gay and lesbian soldiers with interviews. There is a big wave of coming out on social media of those people who are serving in the military with clear, reasoning, and which is understood, I think, to everyone. Maybe this is your last day. Maybe tomorrow you will be killed. You want to come out. You want to live your days as a person you are. And secondly, of course, it's also you want the same rights. You serve to your country. You kind of, give your life to the country. You want the country give you equal rights. At the same time, the question is, of course, what happens with those people who are not in the military, who are not such good Ukrainians, who flee Ukraine? And here is the debate, and the second topic would be then, of course, moving to trans identities. Ukraine, surprisingly, has been doing quite well as compared to other countries in the neighborhood with regard to trans rights. And our activists achieved much with changing the legislation. For example, for transition, according to several leading figures in trans movement, Ukraine now has one of the best legislation systems for transition, for change of the documents, and all the parts of it. At the same time, what happened after February 24th, of course, the government didn't really care about this group. We heard about the stories about trans women who didn't change their documents yet, and they still had documents with gender marker M, who couldn't leave the country, and therefore, were in limbo in the Western Ukraine, where still they could be attacked. And again, this all doesn't change the situation with homo and transphobic violence in the society, which increased not because we have now more trans and homophobic people, but because people who were already like this, they got access to weapons, they get their violence somehow legitimized, so they feel that, that will be not that punished or policed as before. And then, of course, all the other issues with access to the medicines, to the hormones, to safe housing, healthcare, and so on. So this is something where we could also go from here later, and I will pause.
Thank you very much. So many programs and subjects. And now I would like to ask you about general topic that was a part of your speeches, and maybe we will have time to say more about the things and research that you did and you were talking about. So maybe because I'm a writer, think that the language is really important. And as I said before, we are here in Poland in a very specific time that we try to change this highly homophobic and transphobic discourse on the one hand, and it comes from the parliament, president, etc. But on the other hand, we try to find our own language just to speak about our decisions, our experience, and usually the group so-called minorities now I try to be the bigger part in the discourse. That's why this is also important, but interesting time when we try to find this language. You said, Łukasz, about this Pole English, that one of the persons said that it's better to speak about their gender identity in English because probably for her or for this person, Polish language is not enough or sounds too Polish to speak about it. And you also, Maryna said about this Russian, Ukrainian perspective and differences on this language level. But first I would like to ask Susan about the specific language in your research. One of your first articles, you start to edit in the beginning of 90s. So maybe you could say something more about the changing of the language in US on these Western countries, because I think that this is something like the example that still is basic for the other language to find a good point of thinking about the language for the minority groups. So could you just, Susan said something about the changing in the language about the LGBTQR plus people?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in that early work that you mentioned, it's like, it just strikes me how, what a different cultural and intellectual environment we live in now, that 30 years ago, it seemed the most important things to say as a sort of critically aware trans person was to resist psychomedical pathologization. That was one of our biggest problems. There were, I would say, skirmishes with trans people and what we would now call cisgender feminists and gay and lesbian people. So there was a work that needed to happen to articulate a trans-centered perspective. That's what really seemed vital 30 years ago. The idea of needing to contest gender ideology and the sort of the demonization of trans lives that way didn't really seem like a big deal. It seemed very marginal. It seemed like something that was very much in the minority of feminist thought, right-wing and ethno-nationalist movements had not organized or mobilized around an anti-transgender position. And that is the single biggest change in the course of my working life, that trans issues have come to be something that is it's a bellwether. It's like something on a front line that is proving very useful for the right wing to use, because I think it does in fact split liberal coalitions, because of, I would say, lack of awareness or prejudice, even on the part of people who you might otherwise think of as liberal or progressive or radical. They might have very different opinions about the trans issue. So it's proven very, very useful. But one of the things that I think is quite difficult to contest, however, and that this is where I think we need to come up with better stories and better strategies, is that, as I think you all know far better than I do, that there is an idea that gender ideology is something that comes from the West. It comes from the US in particular. It is a suspect form of quote unquote identity politics. There is an entire way of thinking, a conceptual vocabulary that is seen as antithetical to local cultures, to other national cultures, to other linguistic communities. It's seen as an imposition by sort of an Anglophone-centered world order that's like linked to questions of globalization, is like something that is a suspect imposition that is put on to other people. I think in particular, I've been reading Putin's speeches, as they've been translated into English, and the way he just literally is saying, like, we have to rescue Ukraine from like being like absorbed into this Western, system. Ukraine is being forced to undergo a non-consensual change of identity. It's being dismembered from the body of Russia. It's like these transphobic ideas are actually the narratives and discourses that are structuring some of the biggest geopolitical conflicts that we have right now. And that is kind of mind-blowing to me. But that the hard part is that it's actually true at one level, that this model of gender or gender identity, of using gender to talk about sexual difference, the marking of a sex-gender distinction, however useful that has been for some kinds of feminism, it is something that emerged in the US in the medical clinic. It's a terminology that was devised by people who I think were essentially trying to contain sex gender diversity, to come up with an explanatory structure for intersex bodies and for cross-gender identified people that could essentially make them targets for biomedical intervention, and that this way of thinking about gender is in fact something that has spread globally with US influence in the post-World War II world. So it's difficult, I think, to come up with a critical analytical vocabulary for addressing some of the problems in that model without at the same time playing into completely ludicrous conspiracy theories about what trans identity means. This is where my work as a humanities scholar comes to the fore, I think, in that, while I'm of course very interested in empirical data and quantitative, facts and figures, I think what is actually needed right now is not more research along those lines that helps us prove that, trans women aren't male sex predators in public restrooms or whatever. It's like that what's needed isn't that kind of evidence, but what's needed is a new story. It's like we need new narrative. We need something that reframes the problems in the present and doesn't play into the kinds of polarizations that exist now. We need a much more fundamental reset of how we imagine what's at stake and the issues that so divide and challenge us right now.
thank you very much. I also agree that we need a narrative and stories and the people who will just set their stories and experience. And of course, in Poland, there is still discourse about that all of the things like gender or non-heterosexual people came from the West. So thank you very much for this lovely gift. Anyway, and now I would like to ask Łukasz about this specific language that it came when people start to talk about their gender identity. Why you think that this is so difficult to find a good words or good part of the language in Polish? Is it something that we still don't have, or is it in progress and most of the people, I don't know, maybe they're too afraid to say something because they don't feel comfortable in it and they feel that they need to find another solution? Or is it just, like we said before or heard, that the things from the West side is better to say about it?
Yes, I wouldn't say better from the West, but it's kind of, especially for my participants who are migrants, and there is the fact of kind of hegemony of Anglo-American culture, which for my participants was really manifested in two ways. The first way, when they moved to the UK and start talking and sometimes learning very early about gender diversity or sexual diversity in English, because there are very different stories there as well. With some of my participants just moved to the UK 1 year before our interview. Some other moved there when they were 6 years old because their parents were just decided to move to the UK. And the other thing, well, the one quote that I read was also because they just learn, as I said, from the digital media, the importance of digital media. I think we also have to realize here, as I said, fan fiction, YouTube tutorials that were available for them in English, so they just learn about it for the first time on digital media. As well, I remember this other person who was saying, also was really struggling with like knowing that there is something that they don't fit into any of the categories, and also Munoz are saying that very often there is a counter-identification first. So it's like more like, I don't know what I am. I don't identify like that. But I actually don't have identification because I first just have this counter-identification. And then this person said like, and then I found somewhere on some Tumblr blog, girl fuck. And I checked that on Wikipedia. It's like, this is it, this is me. And there's so many stories in that, in many different, for a lot of LGBTQs, that they have this revelation moment of this is me, either because they watch it in a film or watch it in the digital media. And here I think it's also important to emphasize the role of digital media as kind of creating these counter discourses and creating this new vocabulary. Who is controlling these categories? Who is inventing this language? Before there was sexologists, medical experts, academics, people who already have some kind of position of power in their societies. Now, all those 170 new genders that were Facebook introducing, it was coming from the communities that were just exploring with their own words, thinking about what it means. There are whole wikis created by communities to explain what is the difference between genderqueer and gender fluid, you know, and they're debating it among themselves. So even though it feels like it's maybe a little bit depressing with all this kind of focus now of anti-gender movement, I think there's also a positive element of the communities, grassroots communities, finding their space online and discussing it, creating it as a much more welcoming and safer space. And as an anecdote related to language, I want to give you like two kind of new names of the people, Polish LGBTQs that organize themselves in the UK. So I actually also work very much, try to be involved in activism, and during my project, I also co-organized some kind of parties for queer migrants. And we were debating with my friends and activists what to call them. And then we came up with the name Polaktastic. And it was because Polak is very often in English, especially in the US, used as a swear word, as something like, you know, oh, you're such a Polak. It's such a negative word. So we thought, let's do it what would do with people with queerness, you know, in the queer culture of reclaiming negative words. Let's reclaim Polak. Also, it's funny because it's in Polish, of course, it means a man Pole, like male Pole. So it's like also a little bit uncanny kind of connotations there. And then I really wanted to combine it with fantastic, because on the other hand, just to make it something more positive than negative, but also to counter this idea that, or actually reflect the idea that very often in the West, Central and Eastern Europe, as imagined as this very sexist, racist, and very homophobic place that like no LGBTQ life can flourish. So almost like as a Polish LGBTQ, it's an almost oxymoron. It's like fantastic idea as a fantastic beast. So something that's not in reality. So that's why I thought Polaktastic had this kind of power there. And some other people in London, a group in London, I was not involved, but now I'm in contact with them. They started organizing queer parties for Polish and Central Eastern European queers. They call it Slav for You. So they're combining Slavic connections with the gay icon, of course, of Britney Spears and Slave for You. So those are some kind of creative ways of thinking about for the Polish queer community in the UK.
I think that the so-called dictionary will be necessary to have it in one place. Thank you very much. And Maryna, you said about the difference in the language, but you also spoke about the queer parents, especially mothers. And it's very close to the idea of motherhood, and I think on the in Ukraine and in Polish it's quite the same. The model of mother who give birth to, of course, son, and he will go to war, and this is so-called post-romantic myth that we are still evaluate, even if the emancipation is going on. So I wonder about the specific language of the queer mothers. Is it different now, especially when they have also the identity as a migrant people, or is it changing through the times that you did your research? What kind of language it is, and what kind of language they use to say about themselves and their experience?
Mm-hmm. I will answer in two parts. It's again tricky and complicated, as everything is complicated and complex. So one thing is for the mothers, I just wanted to say that interestingly, but not surprisingly probably, this parents movement, which in fact is mothers movement, in Ukraine resulted being very efficient, exactly for the reason that you mentioned. So the figure of mother is kind of glorified and sacred, and especially since in the beginning of this movement, since 2013, when the organization was founded, and then for probably 5, 6, 7 years, most of the mothers were also in their 50s, 60s. So there were mothers of quite adult LGBTQ people, also because that generation used to give birth early. So you would have a figure of a very traditional mother, very, you know, how you imagine Ukrainian mother or post-Soviet mother. And this was very powerful tool for advocacy. Because, you know, one thing is to attack, even for right-wing groups, is to attack a non-normative for them guy with pink hair. It can be even seen by some as something justified. Another thing is to attack an elderly woman. And when we had those elderly women speaking openly to the TV camera that this is my son, yes, okay, he's gay, or this is my lesbian daughter or trans child, even though mostly then in the beginning these were gay and lesbian children, you know, it kind of resonated with larger audience and had very many positive reviews. And even through mothers, we lobbied the acceptance of tolerance classes at schools for teachers, through advocating through the bullying and through the mother concerns issues. So our kids are being bullied at schools, we need to help them. At the same time, when it comes to identity of people who were displaced, and especially those who had to leave Ukraine, I mean, I don't need to tell you that Ukraine is a very large country, and even though it might be homogeneous in eyes of outsider and media, and I know that many Europeans, it's not the case for Polish people, of course, but for many Europeans, it was just now the realization how big Ukraine is. So the same applies to LGBTQ community, and people who are within it sometimes even don't define themselves as a part of the community. And of course, the obvious thing that we always unify people under this umbrella of many letters. It doesn't mean that all those people have same needs, same problems and challenges. And then within even gender identity or sexuality, of course, then you also have class, location from where these people are coming, their profession, and so on. And so, in addition to, of course, so one thing is that I said there were specific challenges the trans community faced because of dependence on hormonal treatment and some other health issues that some of them had. Also because, unfortunately, in Ukraine, healthcare system is still very, very trans exclusionary. But for many people, the problems that they faced were very often, as they reported in interviews, of course now the research is very preliminary, it's very superficial, but still was related more to other characteristics. So, you know, depending on who these people were when they crossed the border, if they could cross the border, whether they spoke foreign language, whether they had any friends or connections abroad, or in Ukraine also, depending on from which region of Ukraine you are. For example, there is a lot of discrimination towards people coming from the eastern part. And some people, especially those who are not, you know, who can be straight passing, so to say, they said we were never discriminated once displaced because I was a lesbian or gay, but I was discriminated because I'm coming from Donetsk region, because nobody wants to rent me an apartment, and this has been the case. So of course, with this, so there is this mix, and then there is a mix of language that you speak, because nowadays speaking Ukrainian is a political choice and statement for many, and so is speaking Russian, which doesn't mean necessarily that you are supporting Russia. And very often, it means that you just want to keep your language. This is a big debate, and it becomes even bigger debate within again this let's call it queer community. Even though, as I said, we can't put everybody in that term, but in social media and on Facebook, Twitter, in interviews, what language you speak becomes a stumbling block. And the last thing I wanted to mention is that decolonization. So the term, the idea of decolonizing Ukraine from imperial past just now became something that people on the street started talking about. It used to be academic term and very much debated. So there was no agreement among Ukrainian scholars whether we agree with applying decolonization towards Ukraine for the connotation how lauded this term is. And now it is something that people say, you know, everyday people who have nothing to do with post-colonial studies. They say, we need to decolonize our society. But then the debate is, if we decolonize it, say, from Russia, but we are leaning towards other colonial power, and then, kind of choosing Western knowledge, is it even better? I will be falling into another trap. And this is just, it's very fresh, very early debate, but we started realizing this, that we are now in between.
Thank you very much. I think that this is the time that I will just let you to have the comments, reflection, or questions, especially to Susan, because I know that we don't have much time to speak in the full debate. So it's also for the audience that are watching us on YouTube. Do we have any questions or a reflection from the online people? Not yet. Okay, so still waiting. So maybe you will have the question, yeah? Not sure if I just come to the person or, yeah, okay. So could you just wait for the microphone because Susan wants to hear us also. Thank you.
I wanted to make a comment about, I'm an immigrant from Ukraine, a bit earlier, when the full-scale invasion started, I was like organizing help for trans people in Poland, as I am also trans myself. I see how the trans community is a bit separated from, the larger cis community, LGBT, you could say, I don't know. It's more connected, like for example, the queer nationalist movement that you talked about. It is real, but it is from my perspective, it is mostly dominated by cis gays and lesbians. Yeah. Trans community, on the other hand, they have to prioritize their own well-being and, from just not being attacked by people, like on the street, and not being harassed by the border guards. They have to prioritize like their own well-being in a way that, they have to immigrate to be able to normally continue HRT, etc. Yes, so I wanted to highlight that trans people are more leaning toward anarchist movements. There are trans anarchists in the Korean military as well. That's what I wanted to highlight, how trans community is more leaning towards like anarchists and punks, which is like, I think, relevant to today's guest speaker.
Thank you for these questions. Maryna, you wanna? I'm sorry.
I think it was more a comment.
Yeah, you wanna comment the comment, or just to have the discuss with this, or no?
No, just to thank you there for valuable addition.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other question or comment from our audience? Yeah. Okay. We will just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a question about language. The discussion about being able to express your identity in different languages made me think about the concept of language ideologies developed by Catherine Woolard, who talks specifically about Catalan and about small minoritized languages and how they are often perceived, often unconsciously, as languages that serve to express a national identity, a small identity, to create community, unlike the so-called big languages that respond to the ideologies of authority and are presented as suitable to talk about universal topics or universal philosophical debates. And I was wondering whether this perhaps could be a way of looking at this linguistic question. So the power dynamics within the languages itself, and whether perhaps it would be useful to think about the ideologies that stand behind those preconceptions of different languages. So to see them as an ideology, not as a fact.
Thank you. You wanna comment this, Susan, maybe, or Łukasz, Maryna?
Okay. Okay, I'll go ahead and jump in. First, I want to say I really appreciated the comment about anarchist politics. That I think mobilizing around a minority identity category can in fact play into forms of neoliberalism that I don't in fact support. A whole rights-based discourse. I mean, of course, you want to have rights, and on the other hand, I think rights only get you so far, and that all of the problems that trans people face, it's like I don't think will be solved by having, you know, trans rights enshrined in constitutions and, you know, in law. The problems that we face are just the really basic problems of living. They're problems of poverty and housing and having meaningful work, of being able to live lives with you know, chosen and given families, you know, and that the level of critique and activism that's needed is not. I don't see it as a minority struggle. It's like I see trans liberation as something that really requires a much more radical address of the conditions of contemporary living. And so I see trans politics as fully in alignment with, you know, with other movements for social transformation, and it just can't be limited to a small minoritarian discourse or set of special demands. And the linguistic question, I think, is really interesting. You know, I think about the ways that you know, what we might call like a specialist discourse on trans identities, like the whole way of thinking about a sex gender distinction, debates about pronouns. You know, what Łukasz was talking about with the proliferation of self-generated identities. I don't think the trans issues map clearly onto a majoritarian minoritarian language question, because in a sense, the language that minorities are using to start articulating new identities for themselves is something that's taking place within what you might think of as a majoritarian language of thinking about gender and sex and sexuality in a very dominant Western-centric Anglophone kind of way. So it's like it's very complicated, and I don't have my thoughts well put together to, you know, to comment on that more. But it's just like I think it addresses something that's really important. And the part that I do think about more along those lines is just thinking about the way that grammatical and linguistic gender works in English, particularly in relationship to pronouns, is something that is in fact being, I would say, exported from an Anglophone context that the rest of the world then has to grapple with, and how it thinks about things like, you know, human rights and minority discourses. That there's something about the lack of a gender neutral third person pronoun in English, the fact that gendering happens mostly only in pronouns, that there is what's called natural gender in English, where rather than gender being something that's more an arbitrary category of how you treat nouns and adjectives in grammatically similar ways, that almost the only place that gendering happens in English is in the personal pronouns. And that then becomes something that's imagined to be natural, that it's just pointing, the grammatical gender is something that just points to a biological fact. And I think it's very difficult to get out of that, you know, to get out of that way of thinking, particularly in English, and that it's one of the places where I think friction happens between languages when thinking translingually or transnationally around how we even think about what we mean by transgender or trans or non-binary or what have you. So anyway, I'll stop now.
Thank you, of course. Łukasz?
Yeah, so Polish, Susan, is even more gendered and even more challenging to to kind of challenge those kind of built-in ideas about gender in the very grammar of the language. So I totally agree, of course, that the language does come with the specific ideology, and I think it was clear in my participants' talk as well how they struggle with it. And as I said, like one person find it easier to use non-binary in English than in Polish, or the other person saying that like the word Pole coming with the idea that it's heteronormative basically. And of course, it's not by definition like that, right? It's not like a fact that it's like that. It's a struggle of what we actually put into that word. And I think it's worth to kind of fight for that. But also with my participants, you could see that there was not really, I think in only like very small percent, like a few only were actually activists. A lot of them were just like ordinary people who just wanted to use whatever felt good for them. And maybe because also they felt so good in English language, they just go for something that felt more natural or more comfortable at that particular moment. But of course, it changes as well. So I think that's interesting. And the one last thing I wanted to say is this, specifically for us in Poland, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, this whole idea that this gender ideology and this, even to some extent, some particular queer politics is coming from the West. You can also see how it's also, how they use very often English words, like gender itself is an English word that is being so much used because it does say something, it's something foreign. The same with queer, but you can also see how queer was used also by some queer activists in Poland strategically in a way, right? That we have queer studies, which doesn't have the same power as saying, I don't know, studia pedalskie or something like that, but it would sound something like that was the origin of the word queer. So in a way, there is this kind of playing with these words, and I think this is a very difficult situation to be in, to kind of just following or being inspired by something that's happening in English or in the West in general, and then being pushed to the wall to explain yourself. Oh no, you're just bringing it from the West. While we can also track how often those movements, especially anti-gender ideology movements, how they get funds from the US, from many other different countries, and they are following the biggest kind of ideologists of anti-gender ideology movement are based in Germany and France. So in a way, they are inspired by the West, so we can actually give it back the same critique to them, and it's a very tricky way to also just saying, I think it would be very just dangerous to just say, no, we are not inspired by the West. And just like, why is it so bad that things are transnational, that we are not in an isolated island, and we all continue kind of in different ways inspire each other, even though, of course, there are some kind of hegemonic culture power relations that we should address as well.
Yes, to add to this, and also to add one more topic to the discussion. So one, yes, Ukrainian and Russian, of course, are also extremely gendered. And we've been having the debate in both countries, I believe, around also using, first of all, just a feminine version of many professions. It's like a huge debate whether you can say professorka, ministerka, prezidentka, and so on. And even in more peaceful times, it was always, as you say in Ukrainian, ne na chasi, it's not a good time. We have more serious problems, right? Economic crisis, political crisis, corruption, whatever. Now, with the war, it is even more than a chasi. Discussing language, and I was following up to your commentary. I want to say that there seem to be some positive developments for let's say LGBTQ people, seemingly from the first sight. So recently there was a survey checking the attitudes of Ukrainians for LGBT people. It was LGBT in the survey, and we saw that actually the support for LGBT, for equality, so the question is whether you support equal rights for LGBT people, compared to 2016, the support doubled. So from 30+% to 63% of people said, yes, rights should be equal. Then, if you look at the question, do you support LGBT people serving in the military? They say 80+% say, yes, we support. So, you know, more people support them joining the military. But then here, I see the risk, because it happened already with Euromaidan, when LGBTQ people decided not to put their identity first in the protest, and they were like more, you know, putting the national interest first, that we need to get rid of the government, and then not to sabotage the protest, because otherwise it could have been associated with the West, with Europeanization, homosexualization of Ukraine, and now the same. So it seems a good momentum to advocate for LGBT rights, and there was a petition for same-sex marriages. But you know, with this support for going to military, and with that, with the faces and the stories that make it to the media, I think that there might be the risk that there are some parts of the community, or all those people who will be accepted in the end, you know, gaining the right to belong or being more approved socially, and others who will be forgotten. And you know, and I wonder how, and this is a question, you know, how to strategize or to advocate for certain groups that are not so socially, such exemplary citizens, and trans people among them, or those who, you know, who had to flee the Ukraine or whatever, because it might, the risk is once they claim for their rights, and as some other minorities, there is always this nena chassis, you know, why are you putting why do you require some special treatment? Why do you want to be this privileged minority? We all suffer a lot. And of course, it is not a competition of who suffers most. But I think we do have this specific risk. It's now this momentum will be taken, but not by all. And what do we do not to let it happen?
This is a very important question, how to do it, and if war ends, and we all hope that it will be soon. So this song about this is more important will be louder, because, well, yeah, this is the main of almost all of the debates about the LGBTQR plus people around. Is there any other question or comments, or maybe from the internet? Not yet. Okay, so I think that we will finish our debate. Maybe it's also because this is the last debate of this conference, and I know it's a Friday evening, so hope that all of the topics that we were talking about on our meetings, of course, should be another part of this and another conversation as usual. But I think it is really important to notice that we will just talking about migrants' rights, queer rights, trans rights, and all of the topics that are very important as a part of the human rights generally. But on the other hand, we came or we are involved in a different languages, different culture area. So it's also important to know that it's the international movement for queer people rights. So hopefully this is the things that will make us stronger to think that we are everywhere. Sorry to say that. So thank you very much, especially for Susan Stryker. Once again, big thank you that you were with us. Maryna Shevtsova and also Łukasz Szulc. Thank you very much for the people who participate in making this conference, and hope that because it was the first Congress, first forum, there will be another one, and also the queer topics will be involved. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, so let me say a few words as an official closing of the conference. So we have spent 3 long days having plenary talks by worldwide known scholars. We had 3 extremely interesting debates. We talked about subjects that are very, very important and difficult at the same time, because we talked about identity, we talked about changes in the systems of education, so that was humanities. We talked about the society, so we mentioned several times the problem of migration. And we had lots of wonderful papers and very interesting discussions, and I hope that it was all very, very inspiring for our guests and for our participants. So I just wanted to say thank you to our guests who kindly accepted an invitation to take part in our Congress, including our guest here. The other ones, well, unfortunately had to leave, some of them at least, but we are still very, very grateful that they sacrificed a few hours of their precious time. And I also wanted to thank all those people involved in the organization of the Congress. So on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty, myself and our team, I want to thank our wonderful Congress secretaries, Kamil, Ania and Norbert. I want to thank the scientific committee that was involved in evaluation of abstracts and the decision concerning the sessions. And I want to thank our organization team, without whom this would not have been possible. That's Maria, first of all, Kasia, who was really invaluable, Rafał, our IT section that provided all the streamings and recordings, Mirek, who is still working very hard, as you can see, trying to catch this moment or these moments, and all the student volunteers in our wonderful green t-shirts who have been extremely supportive during the whole Congress. So a huge thank you to everybody. And at the beginning of the Congress, we were not really thinking why we called it the first International Congress. I think this just kind of came up. Now we start thinking that if we called it the first, then perhaps there should be a second. And I don't think we are willing to do and think about it right now, because right now we are, none of us is really into the organization of anything. But once we have a good night's sleep and catch a breath, probably we will get back to this idea, especially that, as you said, there are so many important things to talk about. And I think that we really need a place and space for such discussions, especially with students, young scholars, and all those people who may not feel comfortable where they are. And as we know, this should actually never take place, that people do not feel comfortable in a place where they are. So thank you very much, all of you, and all those who are watching us, and all those who are not watching us, but they know that we are extremely grateful to them because they helped us yesterday and 2 days ago. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon. Thank you.